Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. This is a Ukraine war breaking news update, a late night one my time for this, and my goodness, I'm going to try not to rant, not get too angry. I've been angry a lot recently. I don't also want to be resigned. I want to be hopeful that Europe will come up with a sufficient answer for this insanity that is taking place. And do you know what? It is worse than we thought. It is very much what I predicted would happen, given the elections in November in 2024 for the US president. This is someone who is absolutely manifestly not supportive of Ukraine and is manifestly supportive of Russia. And at every opportunity we are getting at the moment in terms of the Riyadh peace talks, in terms of JD Vance at the Munich Security Conference, in terms of anything that anyone seems to say, not least Trump, we are hearing a regurgitation of Putin talking points. And tonight is the single worst example. It is absolutely horrific. And I don't think anyone any longer can, and there are a lot of analysts now saying this. Really, if you want to see a great interview, go and see the Bulwark's interview with Susan Glasser. That is really very good. There is no excuse now for thinking that Donald Trump is in any way supportive of Ukraine. There's no excuse for thinking that. That's over. This is done. Just listen to his words. His words tonight were absolutely egregious. And anyone that still maintains he's the guy, anyone that keeps accusing me of Trump derangement syndrome, really need to jog on. You really need to just go away and don't come back, because it is as bad as I say it is. And this is on the same day that there is intelligence coming out, American intelligence coming out, that Putin still aims to occupy all of Ukraine. He's not interested in a peace deal, only faking negotiations, according to NBC News reports citing intelligence. So, with that in mind, what has happened tonight? Well, just before we get to that, during a Donald Trump presser where he berated Ukraine, and essentially sided with Putin. At that time, where he said the negotiations are going really well, Russia are sending more ballistic missiles into Odesa than I think we've seen at any time since the war has begun. Apartment buildings, shopping centres, just genocide, says Jay in Kyiv, while this MFer Trump says what he says. Berating Ukraine, demanding money, praising Putin. Russians just launched one of the largest ballistic missile attacks of the war onto the people of Odesa. So just hold that in your mind when we understand what is going on in the White House now. It starts with lies, with outright lies. And we'll talk about whether it is a lie. I mean, there's no good option here. This is a dilemma for those who support Trump. So what you're about to hear is either a massive lie, or it is rank stupidity and someone pulling numbers out of their arse, or it is being disinformed or misinformed egregiously by your own staff. There is no good option here. All of them indicate rank irresponsibility. So this is what we hear from Donald Trump tonight.
That Russia wants to force Ukraine to hold new elections in order to sign any kind of a peace deal. Is that something that the U.S. would ever support?
Well, we have a situation where we haven't had elections in Ukraine, where we have martial law, essentially martial law in Ukraine, where the leader in Ukraine, I mean, I hate to say it, but he's down at 4% approval rating.
Okay, so there is martial law. They've been invaded. There haven't been elections because it's constitutionally not appropriate for there to be elections. We've been through this before. The UK didn't have elections for 9 years because of the Second World War, and we weren't even invaded. Ukraine has been invaded. Holding elections when you've been invaded is problematic for a whole host of reasons. I've done an entire video on that single topic. You can go and look at it and the rationale for why they shouldn't hold elections. This is a Russian talking point. He is regurgitating a Russian talking point. This is exactly what Putin would want to hear, because Putin has made these claims himself, or the Kremlin has. And then he says that Zelenskyy has a 4% approval rating. This is demonstrably false. There are only one set of polls recently that show him to have a 52% approval rating, which is admittedly somewhat down from the 77% approval ratings at the end of 2023. This is not a 4% approval ratings. That's absolutely not true. So what's going on here? If you are a defender of Trump, please help me out here. Please help me. Like, if you were trying to be as charitable to Trump as possible, what is happening here? Is he lying? Pulling a number out of his arse? Getting something wrong? Misremembering it? But then that needs to be corrected. There needs to be someone coming out and correcting that straight away and saying, by the way, that was wrong. Actually, it's not a 4% approval rating. It's a 52% approval rating. Or is he being disinformed by his team around him? Which I don't know of any other options there, really. Please let me know. If you are a massive defender of Donald Trump, what is happening there? Because this is massively, massively irresponsible. When we wonder why the American public have a degrading support for Ukraine, when the president himself is giving them a permission structure not to approve of Zelenskyy, because if you heard that and believed it, you would think, well, the Ukrainians don't like him, so why should I as an American like him? Why are we supporting someone that even the Ukrainians don't like? That is incredibly irresponsible. This is dangerous, right? I have lost what last vestige of I didn't have any respect for Trump, but it's now into even greater minus figures, negative numbers, because this is not acceptable.
And where a country has been blown to smithereens, you got most of the cities are laying on their sides. The buildings are collapsed. It looks like a massive demolition site. The whole, so many of the cities. They haven't done it in Kyiv because I guess they don't want to shoot too many rockets in there. They've done it 20%, but they haven't done it 100% if they wanted to do it 100%.
So interesting that someone has now corrected him. He's now saying Kyiv hasn't been hit. So this is, I guess, thank goodness for small mercies. He's saying Kyiv hasn't been hit and then gives some kind of excuse. And that actually throws in a 20%. Somebody's had a little word with him and said, by the way, only 20% of Ukraine is occupied by Russia. And of that 20%, not all of it is complete ruins. So, you need to be careful about what you say. And it seems that he has kind of tempered some of those wilder claims. But still, this is not responsible reporting.
It would probably happen very quickly. But you have cities that are absolutely decimated. And yeah, I would say that, when they want a seat at the table, you could say the people wouldn't the people of Ukraine have to say, like, it's been a long time since we've had an election. So
Ukraine is not allowed a seat at the table to discuss Ukraine's future because they haven't had an election, because they've been at war, and they're under martial law because they're at war. They've been invaded, and it's written within the constitution that they shouldn't have elections. But because of that, they're not entitled to a place at the table. This is if I was there, I would be shouting at Trump. If I was Zelenskyy, I'd be rugby tackling this man to the ground. Had to be held back on him.
That's not a Russia thing. That's something coming from me and coming from many other countries also.
No, that is a Russia thing. You are regurgitating Russian propaganda. Trump calling for regime change in Ukraine, says Yaroslav Trofimov, with a completely made-up 4% approval rating on Zelenskyy. Timothy Milovanov says Trump says Zelenskyy has a 4% approval rating. Not true. And there should be elections. Answer: Russia wants to force elections in Ukraine. Do you support Trump? This is not a Russia thing. It's coming from us. Not so sure. And then that's really, really bad. Arguably, it gets worse. As Julia Davis says, I can't think of any printable words right now. She's that apoplectic about what's being said. Aaron Rupert says Trump's message to Ukrainians who feel betrayed by his administration, quote, I hear you're upset about not having a seat. Well, they've had a seat for 3 years. You what?
Do you have any message for Ukrainians who, after 3 years of fighting, might feel betrayed or disappointed at not having a seat at these initial talks in Saudi Arabia?
Well, I think I'm really disappointed in what's happened. I've been watching this for 3 years. It's a war that would have never happened if I was president, and I've been watching these people being killed at levels that you've rarely seen, not even close, since the Second World War. And I'm very disappointed. I hear that, they're upset about...
Disappointed in who? Disappointed in... Because it sounds like you're disappointed in Zelenskyy. They don't get a seat at the table. Why not? Because I'm disappointed. Who should you be disappointed in? I'd be disappointed in Vladimir Putin for invading a sovereign democratic country and murdering their civilians. That's who I'd be disappointed in. You're disappointed in what? Zelenskyy, and therefore he doesn't get a seat at the table. Are you serious here? Who voted for this guy? Who voted for this absolute plum fool?
Not having a seat. Well, they've had a seat for 3 years and a long time.
They've had a seat for 3... They've been invaded for 3... You've had a seat at the table. What table? What table have they had a seat at? I said I wouldn't get too angry because I want this to be like at least somewhat professional. But I don't think I can hold myself back. Like, this is utterly unacceptable on any metric. I can't believe that people seriously think this human being is a decent human being.
That, they're upset about not having a seat. Well, they've had a seat for 3 years and a long time before that. This could have been settled very easily. Just a half-baked negotiator could have settled this.
A half-baked negotiator could have settled this. You said you would solve it in... You settled this in 24 hours, even before the inauguration. You didn't, and you haven't. And now it's 180 days, and now maybe by the end of the year. Don't give me the half-baked thing. Don't give me that this was easy to solve. You had a military superpower invading a not military superpower. How do you solve that other than just capitulating and surrendering to Russia? That's how you solve it. And that's what your negotiations are seeking to do.
Years ago, without the loss of much land, very little land, without the loss of any lives, and without the loss of cities that are just laying on their sides. You have those magnificent golden domes that are shattered, will never be replaced. You can't replace them. 1,000-year-old domes that are so beautiful. You can't replace that. The whole civilization has changed because of what. So when they're worried about not being seated, you mean somebody that should have gone in?
Why are you not blaming Putin? Why are you not doing this? Why is there not a single negative word against Vladimir Putin here?
And made a deal a long time ago.
It's absolutely unbelievable. Call to activism says, holy shite. Trump says Zelenskyy should never have started the war. Please don't make this even worse, but it's worse.
And I think it's going very well. But
the talks.
We weren't invited. Well, you've been there for 3 years. You should have ended it 3 years. You should have never started it. You could have made a deal.
You should have never started it. So he's now blaming Zelenskyy for starting the war. You don't have a seat. So he's talking about, we know he's talking about Zelenskyy because you had 3 years. You don't have a seat at the table. So we're talking about Zelenskyy not having a seat at the table. You shouldn't have started it. So Donald Trump, the president of the United States of America, is blaming Volodymyr Zelenskyy for starting the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I just want to put that out there for anyone that is still out there supporting Trump and thinking this guy knows what he's talking about and this guy's right, because empirically he is not right. Which means if you believe that, you are wrong.
Could have made a deal for Ukraine that would have given them almost all of the land, everything, almost all of the land, and no.
So We should just, if our house is invaded by someone, we should strike up a deal straight away. You do not defend your house. The Second Amendment, where's your Second Amendment rights here, matey? You don't defend your house with a gun. You just let let the thugs come in. You let the burglars come in. You then strike up a deal straight away. How much of my house do you want? You've come in. No, we've just come in to burgle. Just take some of your jewels and money. You know, not that I have jewels, but you know what I mean. No. Please, no. How much of my house do you want? Like I was just watching Donald Trump, the president of the United States, talk about the war in Ukraine, and I'm just trying to learn from him because he's this 4D chess player. He's this amazing deal maker. He's brilliant. He's the best. He's going to solve this thing in a day. He's solving this thing. I mean, it's not in a day, but he's solving it, right? By giving that country to the invader. So I'm learning from that. You've invaded my house. How much of my house do you want? Like, straight away, it's all right. I'm not going to put up a fight. Just have some of my house. Let's do a deal.
People would have been killed, and no city would have been demolished, and not one dome would have been knocked down. But they chose not to do it that way. And President Biden, in all fairness, he doesn't have a clue what he was so bad for.
So he's blaming Zelenskyy and then blaming Biden. As this source says, Putin started the war by invading Ukraine. Trump is literally spreading Putin talking points from the podium. What a disgraceful asshole, this guy says. Michael McFaul, the former ambassador to Russia, says Ukraine did not invade Russia. Russia invaded Ukraine. As an American, this is so embarrassing. To all Ukrainians, especially the families who have lost loved ones due to Putin's barbaric invasion and terrorism, I apologize. Donald Trump, about Ukraine not being invited to Saudi Arabia talks. I heard we weren't invited. Well, you've been there for 3 years. You should have ended it 3 years ago. You should have never started it. Constantine says, who's a Ukrainian? Trump suggests that the war could have been avoided if Ukraine just gave a little bit of land to appease Russia. Apparently, he is referring to Donetsk and Luhansk region. That worked well in the past. Trump again blames Zelenskyy for the war, reciting another verbatim Kremlin talking point. Jay in Kyiv says, and then goes on to quote, I like Zelenskyy personally. He's a good guy, but I personally don't care. You have a leadership in Ukraine that has allowed the war to continue. So that's from another part of the interview or the presser. He has allowed the war to continue. Putin has allowed it. Putin has made it continue. Never says a single thing against Putin. Everything is blaming Zelenskyy or blaming Biden. And as Republicans Against Trump says, at this point, every Republican in Congress who claims to support Ukraine but refuses to condemn Trump is effing useless. And the same for any of my audience that does this. I don't care if I am burning my bridges with people who are members or subscribers to this channel. If you are not morally literate, then we need to part ways. Because if you can't see what this man is telling you to your face, then you live in idol worship blindness. Tommy Vitor from Pod Save America says, every time Trump talks about the war in Ukraine, he blames Ukraine, not the Russians who launched the attack. He only speaks passionately about the loss of golden domes. This is super important, by the way. And architecture, not the people. It's hard to imagine a better outcome for Putin than this. Putin is popping corks. He is laughing. And we know this is the case because the propagandists are telling us that it couldn't be better. They are laughing on national TV about what is taking place in the White House, in Riyadh. Michael Weiss, who's a brilliant reporter on the war in Ukraine, I think we can stop calling it a negotiation. This is a wholesale adoption of the Russian position. He even blames Ukraine for starting the war. I can't begin to think how Zelenskyy feels tonight. I would be apoplectic with rage. Bill Browder says, for someone who has spent the last 15 years working on sanctioning Putin and Russia, this is not the tweet I wanted to read this evening. Hard to imagine worse news than this. Okay, so let's talk about Rubio, Waltz, and Vitkov.
Well, sanctions are all the result of this conflict. There are sanctions that were imposed as a result of this conflict. And so I would say to you that in order to bring an end to any conflict, there has to be concessions made by all sides. We're not going to predetermine what those are. We're certainly not going to negotiate this today or in a press conference for that matter. But and there are other parties that have sanctions. The European Union is going to have to be at the table at some point because they have sanctions as well that have been imposed. Well,
and I talked about this earlier. It's like, well, they're going to have to lift sanctions. Europe will be involved at some point later. United States is ready to lift sanctions on Russia. If you look at what Rubio said 2 years ago, I've got this ready for tomorrow. Rubio, what he was saying when he wasn't in government and what he's saying now is entirely different. Now he's towing the party line and saying what Trump wants him to say, but his true feelings came out at the beginning of the war. And he said something like, Putin is a liar, you can't negotiate with a liar, or something like that. And now he's negotiating with Lavrov. And there's another analyst was talking about how Sergei Lavrov's been foreign minister for forever and a day, right? Rubes is a noob, right? This guy is a newbie. There's a very good possibility that Rubio will be eaten alive by Lavrov. And it's looking like that's what's taken place over the last 24 hours. Michael McFaul, again, says, admiration by so many Republicans for Putin, a brutal dictator with no respect for human life, individual liberties or private property who hates America, is one of the most shocking developments of my life. I never saw that coming. Congress is compromised. The Trump administration is compromised. Artois says, anyone that still thinks the folks sent to negotiate with Russia, Rubio, Walls, Witkoff, by the US are some gigabrain 5D chess masters, you should know that the Russians are openly laughing at you on state television, social media and blogs and can't believe their luck right now. Michael McFaul again. I'm sure Putin can't believe his good fortune these days. Trump's relentless caving to Putin will only encourage the Russian dictator to demand more. Zelenskyy, now it looks like, from what I can gather, Zelenskyy is super angry. There have been some statements. It seems like Russia and the US, he says, are preparing an ultimatum to Ukraine, talking about Ukraine without Ukraine. We didn't accept ultimatums in 2022 when the situation was much more serious and nobody was helping us, and I have no intention of accepting any ultimatums now. So the problem, as I said earlier today, is that you have a divergence of approach. The US now appears to be an adversary of Ukraine. You have the EU that is still behind Ukraine and is willing to support Ukraine. You've got a big military aid package coming out tomorrow. We have, being announced tomorrow as far as I can work out. And we have Ukraine wanting to obviously stand up for its own objectives. And if we are going to go in our separate directions, what I really hope is that will be able to happen without the US going, well, we're going to put restrictions on Starlink being used in Ukraine. We're going to lift sanctions on Starlink in Russia. We are going to lift economic sanctions on Russia. And we are going to stop Ukraine from being able to use American hardware by not providing them with maintenance, support, and weapon and ammunition. So if like HIMARS missiles, if the US starts doing that, Ukraine are really buggered because they won't be able to replace that kind of hardware quickly from within Europe. And when you see Odesa getting absolutely hammered tonight, it's a disgrace. It's an absolute disgrace that Trump is saying what he's saying. I can't believe we've seen such a turnaround in a month. And do you know what? I did tell you so. I did tell you who would be better for Ukraine, and it wasn't Trump, and it isn't Trump. Now, some of you have been saying, well, this is early in the negotiations. This is what happens, and blah 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 blah. This isn't what happens. You don't have an supposed ally going in, giving before negotiations, giving away your leverage, then going into negotiations, not inviting the country that's been invaded, then doing a deal, an economic deal, and we're hearing even more detail about that. It's purely an economic deal. And then have the president slag off the country that's been invaded, blame them for being invaded, and then say that Zelenskyy, lie about Zelensky's popularity and say he should be kind of replaced and whatever. It's just absolutely shocking. Then we hear this. So we are also seeing, and you can argue with me if you want, but bring the receipts. We are seeing the United States slide itself into autocracy. And it is incredibly worrying that they are going the way of Viktor Orban's Hungary, Vladimir Putin's Russia.
Lastly, we have another executive order that President Trump signed relating to independent agencies. This executive order would establish important oversight functions in the Office of Management and Budget and its subsidiary office, OIRA, supervising independent agencies and many of their actions, and also reestablishes the longstanding norm that only the President or the Attorney General can speak for the United States when stating an opinion as to what the law is.
Thank you very much, Will. That was the primary purpose of this conference.
So actually the primary purpose of the conference is for a Trump official to announce that Trump has signed an executive order claiming that only the President and Attorney General can speak for what the law is. That looks to me like dictatorship. Timothy Milovanov, I'm stunned at how quickly checks and balances in the US have collapsed, as if they never existed. Just a handful of people can seize control of the executive and ignore the courts. In Ukraine, that wouldn't stand. If the judiciary failed, people would be in the streets. Was the world's most famous democracy always this fragile, surviving only on the hope that its leader wouldn't turn authoritarian? Where are the real institutions to stop a takeover? I may be wrong. I clearly don't fully understand US democracy, he says, and my take might be too superficial. That said, I believe the US needs a shake-up. Many of Trump's actions, despite the controversy, strike me as necessary disruptions. The execution of this disruption might lack competence. The Doge is a prime example. It is likely to miss the necessary background and context and will do much more harm than good. My main point remains, in a truly stable and healthy democracy, institutions should be far more resilient, making such a drastic shift much harder to pull off. At the same time, they should have been strong enough to self-correct before fueling public frustration and populist anti-establishment waves. A similar dynamic seems to be playing out in Europe, but I recognise that my perspective is limited. I'm just a Western-trained Ukrainian focused on helping Ukraine survive, stay democratic and remain part of the West. Where are the people? Where is the real opposition? The effective protests? The coalition strong enough to push back and hold power in check? Democracy is more than just elections. The US democracy, of course, will survive and continue, but right now it looks to me far weaker than I once believed. And I think he's really underplaying it there. And Andrew Perpetua says, the main problem with American leadership right now is the complete failure of the American intelligence apparatus to supply the American leadership with accurate intelligence. You can tell by the things they say and how they say it, both Biden and Trump, that their intel is divorced from reality. And I agree with this. However, it's rather difficult when the President of the United States, Donald Trump, refuses intelligence briefings. Famously, he did that in the first administration. He doesn't take intelligence briefings. And when he did take them, he didn't read them. They had to be like PowerPoints with pictures. And I'm not making this up. This is the truth. And as according to those involved with this, they did they would take them more on board if they had pictures of Donald Trump in them. So it's quite difficult for the intelligence apparatus to fulfill their duty in supplying leadership with intelligence if the leadership doesn't want to listen to the intelligence, and if the intelligence doesn't fit in with their ideological agenda. You can't, I don't know how the intelligence apparatus can force themselves into the heads of Stephen Miller. I saw Stephen Miller tonight on CNN get really angry when he was challenged on breaking the law, on sacking VA veterans. Well, actually, on like the territorial army and recalling people from duty and all these kind of things that are happening at the moment that are against the law. He was called out on it. He said, well, I'd like to know what law that was. And then the news anchor on CNN quoted him the law. And then he just got really angry. It's like, well, if you're not being briefed, if you don't understand what you're doing, if you're not getting the intelligence, there is a real problem. But if these people aren't willing to take on board the requisite knowledge to do their jobs properly, then I don't know how you can force that to happen when these are the ones that are kind of making the rules. The final thing I will leave you with is this. And I say this as an atheist philosopher. Donald J. Trump says, numerous states introducing Bible literacy classes, giving students the option of studying the Bible, starting to make a turn back. Great! As Rubio Chowdhury says, according to the Bible, you should be put to death for adultery. Take some of that Bible literacy, Trump. Let me know what you think. I'm trying not to be angry. I'm trying not to be despondent. But my goodness, the worm has turned. And the Trump administration appear to be working for the Russian government. Prove me wrong.